All right, we were talking about learned behaviors, and we were talking about imprinting. And I said that there's five types of learned behaviors, and imprinting was the first of the five types. So now I'm going to continue with part two here. All right, so switching, there we go. The next type is called spatial learning. Spatial learning is the establishment of memories that reflect the physical structure of the environment. I love this experiment that was done with these poor wasps. So it says digger wasps. So they use a cognitive map. So they have a mental map. A wasp has a mental map. It makes sense, right? Like, how do they get back to where they need to go? And how do they go back and forth? Like, it's amazing. So it says digger wasps locate their nests by association with physical markers in the area. So in this case, there was a wasp nest down below, and they surrounded it with pine cones. So the wasp knows that it sees the pine cones, and that's where its nest is. So then the sneaky scientist moved all the pine cones to somewhere else, and now the wasp, and it was interesting because the wasp isn't using pheromones in this circumstance. It's not using scent. It's not using hearing. It's using visual. It's using a cognitive map to identify where it's supposed to go. So that was interesting. So spatial is a type of learned behavior. The next one is cognition. So cognition is the most complex of these learned behaviors. Cognition involves awareness, recall, remembering something, reasoning, thinking it through, and evaluating. Now, here's a fascinating example. So, problem solving is the process of finding a strategy to overcome an obstacle. Honeybees, here's this cool example. Honeybees can remember and distinguish same from different. So, in the first experiment, the honeybees were given food when they traveled through two holes that were the same. And if they traveled through the hole that was a different color, then they didn't get food. So they learn this, they practice it over and over again. Same, they go for the food. Same, they go for the food. Same, they go for the food. But then the researchers mix it up and they change the pattern, and now the bee flies, and they show the same pattern. So there's no food. The bee is not smelling it. So they just show a pattern of black and white striped lines, and the bee, instead of going the same direction that it had been going all along, goes the other direction because that's the same. It's the same pattern. So it was a super interesting experiment where they were able to locate food. There was no food given in the second example, by identifying where the pattern was the same. So it says pattern maze, B checked the same pattern for food, and that's showing the use of strategy. All right, another learned behavior is called associative, connecting one environmental feature with another. So, for example, blue jay learns to associate eating a monarch butterfly with subsequent vomiting, which is really a complicated thing, and you need to understand how complicated that is. That's difficult for my dog. For example, my dog who pees on the carpet, and then I yell at her, she doesn't necessarily associate the two. She doesn't necessarily know that her peeing on the carpet is what's leading to me yelling at her. So I've learned not to yell at her. I don't yell at my dog. I hug my dog and tell her that she's a great kid, even though she pees on my carpet. Anyway, so this is what associative learning is, and it's really amazing that this blue jay can then figure out, and then blue jays or other birds and whatever learn once they've eaten a monarch butterfly not to go back to that. Ugh, made me feel yucky. And this is a whole field of study by a famous psychologist named B.F. Skinner. And if any of you go into psychology, which that was my first major, you'll learn all about B.F. Skinner and operant conditioning. But he did many, many experiments with operant conditioning. Some of you may have heard about ringing a bell and having dogs salivate. You ring the bell and feed them. You ring the bell and feed them. You ring the bell and feed them. You ring the bell and you don't even have to feed them, and the dog starts salivating. That's operant conditioning. They've associated the ringing of the bell with the arrival of food. In this case, this is an example using rats. In this case, rewards introduced to increase a behavior. So they push down on the lever and they get food for it. But then they can also use a punishment to decrease the behavior. So if they push down on the lever, it shocks them. So then they stop doing that behavior. So it's a way of them connecting, them associating either good things happening when they push down or bad things happening when they push down. And some of them are kind of mean. So just saying. All right, and then learned behaviors, social learned behaviors, and this does not occur in most organisms, but we see it a lot in the ape families. So learning through observation and interaction with others. For example, in the upper right-hand corner, a young chimp learns to crack nuts by observing elders. So they're using a rock. They have a tool. That's a really unique thing in the animal kingdom, using tools. We used to think that only humans used tools. Now we know better. But taking a rock and smashing it and then being able to eat the nut after that, and the youngins have to watch that in order to know how that behavior. Same thing down below. Kittens innately know how to pounce on moving things, so they sort of hunt innately. They automatically know how to pounce on things. But they don't know how to kill. They don't know how to swiftly kill their prey. And so that's something that the mother has to teach. So that's an example of social learning in that case. All right. And then what we've been saying all along is that for a behavior to continue and to be part of that species, it has to have been successful. And so behavior evolves over time and behaviors become more and more complex. So let's talk. This is a very disjoint part of the presentation. So we'll just kind of talk about several different topics here. So the first one's behavior and genetics. All behaviors are affected by genetics, including the ability to learn. So even when I was saying, like, we were talking about the fixed action patterns and the innate, we were saying, oh, that's all genetics. All of it is genetics. There's genetics involved in everything. So even being just able to learn something has some genetics, but they can be affected by mutations and are subject to natural selection and evolution. So we can have mutations that change our ability to learn. We can have mutations that change our behaviors, and not just humans, but in the animal world. I love this x-ray. It cracked me up. I was looking for maladaptive behaviors, and I found this one. This is a beautiful x-ray of a frog that ate 30 rocks from his habitat. We would call that not a beneficial behavior. So beneficial behaviors are passed on because the parent is successful, eats well. It's a beneficial behavior, and they pass it on to their offspring. Maladaptive behaviors, those are bad behaviors, make the organism less successful. This froggy's not likely to be reproducing too much, and then that behavior should discontinue with that particular organism. All right, more about behavior and genetics. So insect calls is another example. There are many species of, and this is an example, green lacewing, which are morphologically identical. That means that physically they look the same to us. We can't tell the difference. And we can hybridize them in the lab, which means that we can have two different species mate. So they're they've experienced behavioral isolation because their calls are different. Hybrid lacewings have songs that have combined characteristics of both parental species. So the hybrids don't have, if you look, this is one species, this is the other species, and now this is the hybrid, this is their offspring, and they don't match anybody. They don't match the calls of either species. So this behavior is genetic, and unfortunately the hybrids don't find mates successfully, and they experience behavioral isolation. The species are already behaviorally isolated, so the hybrids are not going to be successful and pass on their trait. All right, another example, migration, such a fascinating topic. There's all kinds of things that go into migration, but part of it is genetics. We know that they form cognitive maps. We believe that they can even sense the magnetic North Pole to give them a sense of direction. But here it says young black-capped birds were captured in Britain and raised in Germany. The birds from Britain demonstrated a migratory preference different from native German blackcaps. So the migratory urge is genetic. This sense of I need to go this direction, I need to travel in this direction, it's genetic. And when they moved these birds to a new location, they still wanted to go the direction that they had from their homeland. Instead of sensing the North and South Pole, instead of sensing that, they have this urge to travel one direction because that part is genetic. All right, this next one says behavior and the environment. Sorry, my picture's covering up all these things. Oh, I didn't animate that correctly either. All right, environmental constraints. So things that are an issue in an environment, they determine fitness, which includes behavior. Behavior should increase reproductive success, and hopefully you're starting to get the hang of that. So here's a super interesting study. We've got crows and how high they fly in order to drop a particular food and allow it to crack open. So it says crows demonstrate a food drop height preference that is energetically optimized. What? We'll talk about that in just a minute. A crow that conserves energy and has more energy for mating and reproduction has more reproductive success. So the crows to fly really high, if they fly really, really high, then the food that they drop is going to break open and they're going to be successful and get to eat it. But now they've just wasted a lot of energy. So what if they fly a little bit lower and drop it? And then it doesn't crack open, then they have to pick it up and fly again and drop it from higher. They just wasted a ton of energy. So optimizing the height that they have to fly and drop it and still get the food to crack open and be able to eat it. That's all about genetics, and that they're actually able to figure that kind of thing out. So it says foraging is an example here, is a food obtaining behavior. That's what foraging is. Natural selection should favor minimized energetic cost, what we were just talking about with the crows, and maximized food acquisition. Optimal foraging theory is what that's called. So here's another example. Drosophila, who are the fruit flies. Drosophila raised in different population densities evolved different foraging population lengths. What? So how far they travel to get food. So on average, if they're in a low population where there's not very many of them, they won't travel very far because they don't need to. So they can conserve energy by just foraging fairly close, get the food they need, and be able to have energy left over for mating. However, if they're in a high population density, then they need to travel further to get their food. So that wastes a lot of energy, but they need to go that far in order to get the food they need in order to survive, in order to reproduce, blah, 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 blah. So you can see based on how they're raised, how far that they're going to travel to try to locate food. All right, behavior and fitness. This is kind of repetitive, but just giving lots and lots of examples. Behavior should increase reproductive success. So here's an example of courtship and mating behaviors. There are three types of, there's more than that. We're going to talk about three main types of mating behaviors. Mating relationships, that's a better way of saying it. So there are the polygamous relationships, which there are two main types. There's polygyny and polyandry. Polygyny is more common. That's where we have one male. They tend to be showy, like in the elk. You can see he's got the big antlers, and he has many female mates. But there's also polyandry, and we see polyandry somewhat common in some types of fish and some types of birds. I'm trying to think who else shows polyandry. But that's when we have one female and then they mate with many different males. And then the last type of relationship is called monogamy. Monogamy is when we just have one pair, and they might mate just for a season or just for a brood, or they might mate for life. Many bird species mate for life. So it's called monogamy, and the offspring survival is substantially higher when both parents are looking after their young. So what are the benefits and the disadvantages of each type? And it depends on the environment. What is the most beneficial for that particular species? Is it better to be monogamous? Is it better to be polyandrous? Is it better to be polygynous? All right. So parental care, and this is what largely determines those three types of relationships. Parental care is influenced by the certainty of paternity. The hypothesis says that the more certain a male is that he is the father of the offspring, the more willing he is to expend energy parenting the offspring. So super cool fish there carrying his offspring in his mouth. So when they're not sure that they're the parent, then they're not going to be as willing to help raise the offspring offspring. So natural selection should favor minimized energetic cost and maximized offspring survival. So what's the best? Some organisms produce many offspring, but then they don't parent them. The turtles, for example, by producing that many babies, there's no way that the parents could take care of that many babies. So they're producing bajillions of babies, 100, 50 to 100, I think is a typical clutch. And then lots of those babies get eaten by birds or other water predators while they're small. And so just a tiny number of those babies survive. You see that in fish all the time. Fish lay hundreds of eggs, and then maybe one fish survives. We all know that from Nemo, right? Finding Nemo, you guys all saw that. Okay, so some organisms produce many offspring, but then they don't parent. So the energy input took place in the making of the babies, so producing lots and lots and lots of eggs. It's a low energetic cost, but they also have low offspring survival. So the example is the leatherback turtles. Whoops. And then on the right side, some organisms produce few offspring, but do parent. So the example here is the blue-footed boobies. We've got both male and females parenting. It's a high energetic cost. That means that these parents, they're more likely to die actually after they've parented because it's so exhausting for them. They fly out, they get food, they bring it back to the baby. They fly out, they get food, they bring it back to the baby. They defend against predators. It's exhausting. Whereas the leatherback turtles, they just laid their eggs and swam away, and there was hardly any energy involved in that. However, these blue-footed boobies, their babies are much more likely to survive. They have a higher survival rate. If we were to compare the two species, now that you can't really compare them, but I'm just going to make a very gross generalization. Out of 50 turtles, maybe only one or two survive. Out of one baby, one, maybe they have two babies. Usually they just have one, there's a good chance that one of their babies will survive. So in the end, the survival rate isn't that different. It's just that in the leatherback turtles, the female didn't have to expend as much energy, but she still didn't get very high survivorship. Whereas with the blue-footed boobies, they had to expend a lot of energy, but they had a high survivorship. All right, and now we're going to talk about the fascinating topic of altruism and whether altruism really exists. So altruism refers to any behavior that an organism engages in which increases the fitness of other organisms while decreasing its own fitness. Okay, does that ever really happen? Well, we like to think that it happens. We like to think that we are altruistic and that we take care of other people and that animals take care of each other. There's a lot of hidden agendas, though. And so let's take a look at that. So it says, here's an example. Vervet monkeys, and you see this in many different species, sound alert calls in response to predators. How can this be explained? So if there's a predator and that monkey there starts screaming bloody murder and warns all of the vervet monkeys in the area, where's the predator going to look? To the screaming monkey. And now that screaming monkey is now in danger, saving everybody else's hides. So how do we explain that? So this is what we're going to talk about. It has to do usually with relatedness. Altruism evolves in populations usually of closely related individuals. So there's this crazy concept, this genetics and evolution concept called inclusive fitness. Anything that increases proliferation of an organism's genes, not necessarily by the organism, is going to increase their fitness. So if an altruistic act allows a relative to survive and reproduce, then that individual's genes survive and are passed down because they're related. They have the same genes. And so if I do a behavior, I won't say you, if I make a behavior that protects my brother shares a lot of the DNA that I have. So even if I die, my brother's genes go on to survive. And so that trait of being altruistic, of saving each other, gets passed on because my brother and I share the same genes. Kind of a crazy concept. So that's called kin selection, the natural selection that favors altruistic behavior by enhancing reproductive success of relatives who then pass on some of the same altruistic genes. All right, here are some examples of altruism. Beautiful naked mole rats. Wow, what a lovely creature. When attacked, members of naked mole rat colonies will sacrifice themselves to preserve the life of the breeding queen. Interestingly enough, all colony members are siblings or cousins. And then down below, female ground squirrels live closer to their birthplace than the males do, where relatives engage in altruistic warning behaviors. And there's many examples of animals that we can see like that. All right, and then the last section we're going to talk about are called cooperative behaviors. Cooperative behaviors tend to increase the fitness of the individual and the survival of the population. So examples of cooperative behaviors would be pack hunting. You see that up at the top, the wolves that are hunting buffalo. Shared rearing of offspring. We see that with all kinds of species. I didn't pick up a picture on this one. Or even of what's called mobbing in small birds. And so I'm a bird fan, and I hope that you start to learn some stuff about fans, birds through me. I hope that from now on, when you hear birds making a ruckus, when you notice that there's a lot of squabbling going on with birds, that you actually take a moment and look around and see why the birds are making a big fuss. A fascinating thing that students see all the time once I teach them what it is called mobbing. And that's where a bird of prey, or in this case, in the case of this is a great blue heron, which is definitely not a bird of prey, but it's just a large bird, gets attacked by smaller birds. And the reason that the birds of prey get attacked by smaller birds is that sometimes birds of prey prey on smaller birds, especially their offspring. So these smaller birds will attack birds of prey, oftentimes in large groups, not just as individuals. You see 3 photos of a red-winged blackbird who's working all by himself, attacking these large birds. So he's attacking an osprey and attacking a bald eagle. In the montage down in the bottom left, you see a group of crows attacking an owl. And the crows, when a murder of crows is mobbing, they're incredibly loud. And so just look up and pay attention and see if you can find what they're attacking and what the bird of prey is, because you'll often see a bird of prey running for its life. All right, and then I think this is the last one, everybody. So the other part of cooperative behaviors, herd, flock, and schooling behaviors are cooperative, and colony and swarming behaviors in insects are all examples of cooperative behaviors. The idea in these circumstances is safety in numbers. So in this top photo, you see some predatory birds, some birds of prey that are trying to attack these flocks of birds, and there's just safety in numbers. It makes it so much more difficult for the bird of prey to focus in on one organism to hunt. And so they're often completely unsuccessful, even though there are, I don't make up a number, 1,000 birds there for them to choose from. And then same thing with the locusts down below. So large numbers of prey overwhelm their predators and increase the chance of survival of the prey. Birds have a hard time getting all those locusts because there's just so many of them. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that is behavioral ecology. Let me know if you have any questions.